I'm thrilled to welcome all of you here and those joining us online for our first event of this week, celebrating the 2024 Open Access Week under the theme Community Over Commercialization. I'm delighted to have with us our speaker, Dr. Angel Matos from Bowdoin College, and our very own alum from the English Department. I can't think of a better way to start off the Open Access Week with a presentation precisely about a recently published open access book. So just a few things here. We are going to be having a Q&A session at the end, both in Spanish and English. You can add questions or comments to the chat, and we'll look at those at the end of the presentation. Today's presentation will be recorded, and we will have the videos and slides available for all afterwards. And here with us today to introduce Dr. Matos is Dr. Nandita Batra, who teaches literature in the English Department and is the program coordinator of the Master of Arts in English Literatures. She is proud to have been the president of the graduate committee of Angel Matos's master's thesis, Materializing the Spectre, the Scapegoat, and the Victorian Bildungsroman. I now turn you over to Dr. Batra, who will briefly present our speaker. Now, let me. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome Angel. So just a brief bio about him. Angel Daniel Matos is an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Bowdoin College, which is in Maine in the US. And he's interested in queer youth literature, media, and culture. He's the author of The Reparative Impulse of Queer Young Adult Literature, which was published by Routledge in 2024, where he draws from queer, temporal, and emotional approaches to examine queer YA's relationship with the histories of negativity that haunt contemporary cultures. An alumnus of the University of Puerto Rico at Mayaguez, and as previously mentioned, the English Department, his work has appeared in a handful of edited volumes and journals, such as Children's Literature, Research on Diversity in Youth Literature, the ALAN Review, Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, Research in the Teaching of English, and QED, a journal in GLBTQ worldmaking. I'm pleased to turn you over now to Dr. Matos.
Hello, everyone. Nandita, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And Grisel Rodriguez, thank you so much for organizing this event. I'm really, really excited to talk to you all about the process of open access publishing, and I get a chance to talk a little bit more about my book and why I decided to make it open access in the first place. So I'm going to go ahead and share a little presentation I made with all of you right now. Google Slides is having a bit of an issue in terms of exhibiting the slideshow, so I'm just going to pass to the slides here. Just keep in mind that the presentation will be available to everyone at the end of the session. So please, please stay tuned for that. So I am thrilled to be talking about my book, The Reparative Impulse of Queer Young Adult Literature. As you can see here, I have a hard copy, but I also published the volume as an open access book. And I'm going to get into a moment what exactly that entails and what it means. And I'm also going to offer some strategies on how you could potentially distribute your own work through an open access format, just to make your scholarship more readily available to everyone in your field and beyond. So one of the first things that I really want to talk about is just how the circulation of knowledge today has changed drastically, especially when we start to think carefully about traditional academic print-based publishing. The more we start to think about traditional print-based publishing, the more that we start to realize that there are a lot of issues that come with it. And even more so, that traditional public print-based publishing doesn't always keep up with the times in terms of how information is circulated, how knowledge is produced so much today. So I have here a set of questions that don't necessarily have answers, but are meant to sort of lead all of you to think carefully about why we attribute so much value to print-based publishing. And amongst these questions, I want to ask you, who has the resources to cover the cost of a print volume, which could sometimes reach the hundreds of dollars in certain disciplines? For instance, the book that I published recently, if you were to buy it in a hardcover format, I believe the market retail price is $180, which is a little bit unwieldy for your average consumer. So that's one thing to think about. Academic books could be incredibly expensive. And if we have a duty to publish knowledge and circulate it, what are we doing by solely publishing our knowledge in really expensive volumes, right? And that's another question that we could ask at this point, is to what extent is traditional academic publishing just really linked to notions of capitalism and neoliberalism as well? Sometimes we can't forget that publishers do approach books first and foremost as a market. What ideas sell? What ideas can be circulated? And this could be especially an issue when you are a scholar that focuses on obscure knowledges, countercultural knowledges, or disruptive knowledges that don't necessarily align with the beliefs and attitudes of the status quo. So one thing to think about is that a traditional academic publisher and publishing through traditional means may not necessarily meet your goals and your aims as a critic and as a scholar. Another thing to keep in mind is that social media, online communities, and collaborative editing have just really changed how we approach writing and scholarship in the first place. And I'm not even going to get into artificial intelligence, which opens up a whole nother can of worms. But something to think about is sort of the prevalence of wikis throughout the past 2 decades, and how, for instance, a lot of the knowledge that is circulated and crafted there does rely on the participation of many people. So things that we could start thinking about in terms of contemporary knowledge production: how has the circulation of knowledge changed today? Who has the physical space to store an ever-increasing amount of journals and books published each year? And this sort of leads to the bigger question, and I know that many of us who are in the English department have experienced this to some extent, but how does an institution prioritize what resources a campus has access to? In an ideal world, a library would be able to provide you the means to access all forms of knowledge, especially if an area of study is present at a certain institution. But we know that that sometimes comes with financial restrictions as well, right? Not every library has the resources available to accommodate or purchase many of the materials, where open access sort of comes in as a sort of antidote to this issue. And this sort of connects to the last point that I have here, which is materiality, access, and resources, right? Who has the physical and immaterial means to access knowledge? What libraries and institutions have the financial resources to access certain data or to access certain information in order to generate cutting edge and contemporary research? And another big question to start thinking about here too is that why is it that the knowledge that we sometimes produce in academic context is solely limited to people within academic contexts, right? Why is it that someone needs to be part of an institution, organization, or just have financial resources to access information in the first place, right? And this is something that I think about a lot, because sometimes people approach academia as sort of a bubble that has no effect on their everyday lives. And I do think that open access helps to break down some of those barriers, right? To let people sort of feel included in the conversations that we generate through our scholarship. So now let's explore a little bit more about open access and what it ultimately enables to us. I first started working with open access materials back in 2018, when a new journal in my field called Research on Diversity and Youth Literature was fairly new and fairly recent in its establishment. And at that time, I didn't know much about open access publishing, but I was really excited about the prospect of having a wider audience and reaching out to people, especially when you work on topics that focus on identity, that focus on equity, power, and control. So working together with John Wargo, who's now at the University of Michigan, we collaborated together to create this issue on queer futurities in youth literature, media, and culture. We had a call of papers. We had about 5 contributors who were ultimately published within this journal. And we were astounded to just see the outreach that this journal ultimately had. Not only are we seeing that the pieces that we wrote, including the introduction to the article, are cited pretty frequently, but again, it was really kind of heartwarming to see that anybody could access that information, and that even more so, readers beyond the scope of academia were engaging with the ideas that we published. And so this is sort of when the spark got lit, and I started to really think carefully about open access publishing and what it ultimately allows and what it ultimately enables to us as scholars and critics. There's 3 main elements that I sort of want to emphasize when it comes to the benefits and the perks of open access publishing, right? And I think the first and foremost obvious one is the notion of ownership, right? You have the right to own, display, distribute, remix, and republish your own work on your own terms, which I think is incredibly significant, because many of the times when you sign a contract with either a journal or a book publisher, it's not always the case that you retain the rights to your own work. And you have to go through various loopholes to acquire permissions to republish or remix your work. So open access does give you a certain degree of control over who can access, read, and cite your scholarship. And even more so, it puts a lot more control in your hands in terms of how your research is displayed or curated to an audience, right? And that can be very powerful, especially if outreach is important in the research that you generate. The second point that I want to emphasize is, of course, access, right? You reach a broader audience and you eliminate the inequities that sometimes come with paywalls and subscription fees, right? We know that this could be especially a problem in academia, where we resort to sort of interlibrary loan to access an article or a text. But for many people who are not connected to an institution, and in the case of many independent scholars, if you're not affiliated with an institution or organization, it's harder for you to access some scholarly materials, right? And oftentimes you can see a range of how much people pay, but you can see people paying anywhere from $20 to hundreds of dollars just to access one article of a journal. And this has specific ethical implications, not only for the humanities, but for fields such as science and medicine as well. Last but not least, impact is incredibly important. You get to increase engagement with your ideas within and beyond the scope of academia. So not only will more people read and potentially cite your work, but it is also a way of addressing the ethical and sociocultural demands that sometimes come with our work, right? And what I mean by this is the following. For instance, I specialize a lot in queer and Latina youth literatures, right? And there's sort of a responsibility that I have to my communities, and there's also a responsibility to disrupt norms that comes along with that field. What would it mean then if I were to publish my scholarship in a format that could only be accessible to a few people or to people who have financial resources? And that's sort of the big reason why I gravitated towards open access forms of publishing. At the same time, I don't want to pretend that open access publishing is completely utopian and that it doesn't come with many issues. And I sort of want to overview some of these just so that you're aware of them as you're considering whether or not to publish in open access. So the first one that comes up quite a lot is cost. Nothing is free in this world. And just keep in mind that there are a lot of people who are often involved in both the editing of either a book or a journal issue, right? Something that we find particularly with journals that are open access is that they almost entirely rely on voluntary labor, which opens up a can of worms and leaves much to say about equity and labor. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. The other big issue, and I'm going to talk about this with more detail, especially when you are publishing an open access book, the author almost always has the responsibility of identifying funding sources to pay for the open access publication of that book. So you can notice that it's still sort of imbricated into like capitalism and marketing. But again, I think more about the bigger picture and the fact that many people will have access to the scholarship that you generate. The second issue I want to bring up is this notion of prestige, and please note that I put that in quotation marks, right? Sometimes people are suspicious of open access journals, either because they rely on voluntary labor, or they're very new, or they don't have the reputation or longevity of traditional presses. And this, for many reasons, sometimes keeps people away from open access journals. And this is especially in the case of people who belong to institutions that are particularly demanding in terms of the rank and the longevity of the journal where you get your work published, right? Again, this is where you have to think carefully about institutional demand and also your personal aspirations as a critic and scholar. Where do you want your work to be situated? Who are you speaking to? And where does that research need to be curated in order for people to access it, right? And then, of course, this goes with the notion of cost. But it's a little bit more complicated with that because we need access to many resources as well to publish in an open access format. For instance, a journal that is open access usually needs to be endorsed by an institution, organization, or group of scholars. You have to make sure that you could find people to edit, review, and copy edit. And again, once again, I want to emphasize this notion of like, this is a labor of love, right? A lot of people put a lot of time outside of their teaching and their own research to make open access scholarship possible in the first place. So these are a couple of notions to keep in mind with open access publishing. We're going to revisit some of these points in a moment, but I want to start talking a little bit more about my book and the process of publishing it in an open access format. So as I mentioned before, this is my first monograph, The Reparative Impulse of Queer Young Adult Literature. And this book was actually developed using ideas and texts that I was thinking about during my master's degree in English education with a concentration in literature at UPR-M, which originally started as an analysis of heteronormativity in YA fiction, but then eventually snowballed into something much bigger. During my PhD studies, I ultimately developed a project that focused on the role of hope, optimism, and feeling good in the creation and reception of queer youth literature. And I sort of finished that at the beginning of 2016, roughly. But something that's really interesting about this book is that the content changed so significantly due to various events that were occurring as I was writing the book. And as I mentioned in the preface of this book, the original project was originally inspired by the death of Jorge Steven Lopez Mercado, which created a huge shift in queer Puerto Rican culture and really affected how many of us felt towards queerness at the time. And then on top of that, we experienced events such as the Pulse nightclub shooting, Donald Trump's election and his establishment of an anti-trans and anti-queer cabinet, the rise in news coverage of queer teen suicide, the development of and rise of social movements such as Me Too and Black Lives Matter, and of course, let us not forget the COVID-19 pandemic, which sort of created a huge shift in how many scholars were thinking at the time. And due to all of these events that were going on, I just started thinking more critically about like the role of pain, of hurt, within contemporary queer representation. And even more so, I was thinking carefully about this critical demand to make queer YA safer and nicer and more comfortable for audiences. And notice that those aspirations do come with a certain degree of privilege, and they also don't take into account the intersectional realities of being a queer teen, both today and in the past. And so the project really changed to sort of more of how does queer YA handle this legacy and this history of pain and hurt that was foundational to the queer imagination, and how does queer YA and media push us to think really creatively about the dialectic relationship between hurt and pain, life and death, and so on. Some of the central questions that I try to address in my book are the following. How do queer literature and media designed for teen audiences engage with the historical and ongoing oppression that has marked queer and trans life? How do these texts and media address pain and trauma, especially during a time in which life is supposedly better for queer teens today? How do these texts handle emotions, and how do they represent the complicated relationship between pain and healing? And then last but not least, how can a historical understanding of queer life push us to envision queerer futures? How does such a perspective alter our understanding of liberation and transformation? And so these were sort of some of the central questions that guided the chapters as they were being created, and that sort of moved the impulse of the entire book, right? And it was not necessarily designed to celebrate hurt and pain, but to think more critically about its role, especially in the queer imagination, and more specifically, the queer teen imagination. So why did I decide to go open access for this volume? And I think I'm going to be really transparent and upfront about matters here. There is a huge tension that many scholars, or that people sometimes anticipate when it comes to publishing our work. And there's this notion of like, you are generating knowledge for the public. At the same time, there's this expectation that you publish for profit, right? And I want to just share with you that the price of the hardcover book is just, again, once again, outside of the price range of many consumers, right? There will be a more affordable paperback version of my book that will be published in 2026. But the question is, if this volume costs $180, what are the chances that readers will pick it up and read it? What are the chances are that someone at a certain institution could teach the book in their classroom when, materially speaking, it is outside of the means of so many people? And this is kind of where open access provided an answer and a solution towards this, right? It eliminated the anxiety I was feeling of not having enough people read my scholarship or engaging with it. And once again, it complies with the overall sort of ethics and sort of aspirations of my work, right? To push people to think about the value of queer YA within and beyond the scope of academia. One of the most common questions that I get when people find out that I made the ebook available for free is royalties. And I'm often asked, what about royalties? Don't you care about getting paid for all of the work that you generated? And I know that this may not be surprising for many people here, but academic scholarship is just not a lucrative enterprise whatsoever. On the average, authors can expect to earn only about 5% of the total sales of the book. And it might reach up to 10% depending on who the author is, right? But we have to keep in mind that for many scholars, profit is not really something that's on our mind whatsoever. We place much more importance on generating and circulating knowledge, especially when we try to focus on social change or inequities that haunt today's cultures in any way, shape, or form. And so the way that this worked for me, after I signed the contract with Routledge, the editors reached out to me to gauge my interest in publishing the book in an open access format, keeping in mind that authors are typically responsible for securing funding to cover the costs of open access publishing, right? Now, usually when you're publishing an open access volume with a major publisher, it doesn't come cheap whatsoever. And this is something that I want to be really upfront about. I ultimately had to develop a proposal for an internal funding opportunity provided at my institution. At the same time, I have to acknowledge that not all institutions have access to these types of resources. And just to give you a sense based on my experience, the cost of publishing an OA text can range anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 per chapter, or anywhere from $10,000 to $13,000 for an entire book. And keep in mind, this will depend on the publisher, it'll depend on the length of the volume, and any other policies the publisher might have. So just remember that, unfortunately, when it comes to publishing books or book chapters, OA publishing doesn't come cheap, and you have to find the means to secure some money to cover these costs. In my case, Routledge worked directly with my institution after I was given a grant to cover the open access costs of this book. So I'll get into more details about identifying funding in a bit later, but really quickly, I just want to overview my book really quickly. So designing this book came with a couple of challenges, and surprisingly, I think people are a little taken back when I told them that only 2 chapters of the dissertation ended up in some version in this book. But what I ultimately decided to do was to not only make people think carefully about these dialectic relationships that I mentioned before, but also to focus on ideas and on texts that really think us to push more critically about what it means to be happy, what it means to be sad, what are we expecting when we engage with queer YA literature, what are the moods and the aspirations that we're keeping in mind when engaging with these texts. So my first chapter, The Politics of Critique and Repair, is sort of giving an overview of the field, but even more so, it's talking deeply about the tense relationship that negative or violent or oppressive content has within the scope of queer YA today. There is this sort of expectation that people engage with queer YA to feel a sense of relief, to feel a sense of so-called normalization when engaging with queerness. And there's even bigger critical moves that are demanding that queer YA distance itself completely from sadness, from despair, and from hurt. And this comes from an incredibly privileged position, right? And something else to keep in mind is when making those statements, who exactly are we picturing in our heads when we think of the readerships of these texts? And the answer for that is usually white, middle to upper class readers, right? As many of us know, many communities, queer communities of color, many queer Latina communities have a much more difficult relationship with feeling good about our queerness due to sociocultural circumstances present in our upbringings. And so each chapter sort of tries to target this really difficult relationship that the field sometimes has with emotion and how certain queernesses should be depicted within the literature. My chapter, More Sad Than Not, really starts to interrogate the place of sadness and even questions whether there's any room for sadness or ambiguity within reader expectations today. Within this chapter, I focus on Aurora Guerrero's film Mosquita y Mari and Adam Silvera's novel More Happy Than Not, to talk about how sadness and ambiguity can be potentially really powerful within our consumption of queer teen culture. And something else that I do in this chapter that I thought was particularly compelling, the main text that I analyzed, which is Adam Silvera's More Happy Than Not, was a text that was notorious for ending in a very sad and devastating way. But in 2020, the novel was revised and the author added a new epilogue to the text that completely undid the devastating ending of the novel and that forced the text to end in a traditionally happy way. In this chapter, I really delve into the implications of what it means to make such an important cornerstone, so-called sad text, happy, and what normative frameworks are ultimately informing what this understanding of happiness is in the first place. My other chapters start to focus on more intense topics that are once again connected to historical and cultural pain and hurt. My third chapter, The Haunting Presence of AIDS, really explores how HIV and AIDS YA literature really taps into the pain that was considered formational to the queer imagination. And I tried to explore different ways in which an author could use motifs, themes, and literary devices to make us think in more deep and compelling ways about AIDS, especially during a time in which the disease has been normalized, and especially during a time in which youth culture has sort of been distanced from the ramifications and implications of AIDS, to the extent that some people consider HIV and AIDS an adult issue. And so I really see how queer YA literature tries to make an intervention on this theme, and to think more carefully about the ways that queer YA literature is still very much haunted by AIDS history, even when it doesn't acknowledge that history up front. One of my favorite chapters in the book is on mortality and permalife. And in this chapter, I draw from Bo Ruberg's concept of permalife, which is a video game device that prevents the protagonist from dying, meaning that they live in perpetuity. And I started thinking carefully about how this device is found not only in queer YA literature, but in queer YA media, as a way of contesting the deathly connotations that sometimes come along with representations of queer and trans life. In this chapter, I focus on two YA novels, Ana Marie Laclamore's Latina trans novel, When the Moon Was Ours, and Patrick Ness's meditation on queer teen suicide in More Than This. And I also include a video game in this chapter, Hades, published by Supergiant Games in 2020. And it's this game where you play as the queer son of the Greek god Hades, and you're trying to find your way out of the underworld. And no matter how much damage the protagonist experiences, no matter how much hurt he goes through, he can't die and he must continue going on. So I really start to think about speculative fiction and speculative media, and to think about how permalife contests tropes such as the bury your gays trope, or the expectation that queer people are doomed to live violent, solitary lives. And they do that by taking the expectations of queerness and death and sort of flipping them on their head. My last two chapters start to really hit on the emotional aims of queer YA. Catastrophic Comforts focuses on the role of emotion, comfort, and closure in our engagement with apocalyptic queer texts. And thinking carefully about what the epilogue in a text is designed to do in the first place. The epilogue is usually a piece of text added at the very end of the novel that really only exists to assure readers that the protagonists are okay, that despite all the trauma and pain that was endured, everything is going to be all right. I start off this text with sort of analyzing sort of what people expect from an epilogue, and I do this by analyzing Suzanne Collins's Mockingjay and the subsequent film adaptation as well. And I try to highlight how often this notion of comfort that the epilogue tries to instill to its readership relies on heteronormative comforts, marriage, having children. I mean, you could think about Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows written by She Who Shall Not Be Named, for instance, and you could think about how that series closes. Here you have a teen protagonist going through so much pain, so much death, and so much trauma, and then what does the epilogue do? It jumps about 19 years into the future and tells us that all is well. And to me, that kind of falls flat. And it doesn't really offer the text nor the reader the opportunity to reckon really carefully with all the harm, violence, and despair that was present throughout the series. And so in order to contest this, I draw from Andrew Smith's 2014 novel, Grasshopper Jungle, which has an epilogue that sort of thwarts the expectations of the epilogue and flips it on its head. It provides us an epilogue that disturbs. It provides us an epilogue that discomforts. And what I try to do is to show that there's actually a lot of hope to be found in this discomfort. There's a lot of hope to be found in being provoked and being challenged and questioning our centrality as humans and our power and dominance over other living beings and other humans. Last but not least, the limits of repair focuses on just thinking carefully about the reparative impulse in queer YA, especially when it comes to people's sort of desires to interpret text in certain ways that enable us to feel good with the literature that we engage with. So in this chapter, I do a couple of things. I first open with Tilly Walden's webcomic On a Sunbeam to think carefully about what queerness means at a time that's so historically removed from our current moment. I then pivot to an analysis of Benjamina Lirasayan's Aristotle and Dante series, focusing especially on the absence of AIDS and HIV in the first novel, even though it was set in the late 1980s, and the subsequent novels focus on an HIV and AIDS narrative. I sort of use this analysis to interrogate what expectations do we have when we engage with queer YA texts? Why do we feel betrayed when a text doesn't include a certain event or a certain form of representation that we expect for a genre? And even more so, what does this tell us about us as readers as we are engaging with queer YA and as we're thinking carefully about its aesthetic and ideological possibilities? So I want to just briefly touch upon how did the OA open access character of the volume transform my book? And I just want to be upfront and say that it transformed it quite drastically. I primarily speak to people within the field, people who read, critique, and teach queer youth texts and media, but I was also quite aware that a broader, potentially non-academic audience would engage with the ideas present in the text, especially since a lot of people want to learn more about queer and trans YA literature. So some of the things I did was, I did simplify the language I used, but I never simplified the ideas. I made sure to include ideas that were incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging, but finding ways to make said ideas accessible to the audience. I deliberately went against expectations to discuss text in the third person, and I used the first person perspective and a way more conversational tone, almost giving the sense that I was like talking with you as you're reading the book. I included an expanded approach to text that moved beyond the written word, and I considered teen films, video games, and webcomics. Frequently throughout my analysis, you will see analyses of teen film that are relevant to the discussion or that enhance the conversation. And then last but not least, I took a way more personal approach to queer YA, including discussions of my involving relationship with the field, and even more so, I deliberately tried to center many, many texts created by trans Latina and queer Latina authors. I also want to mention very briefly that the structure of the book also changed. And what I mean by this is I had to start thinking about the open access book a little differently, because while people would be able to access the volume as a whole, they could nonetheless also download individual chapters, meaning that they could potentially read the chapter outside of the context of the entire volume. So the challenge here was, how do you design a chapter that works independently, but that nonetheless is part of a larger story that you're telling across your book? And I had to just make sure to pay extra careful attention to that. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to discuss some suggestions and resources, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions that the audience might have, right? So first and foremost, I have a set of questions here that are useful to ask yourself as you're considering whether or not to publish in an open access format, right? First and foremost, where is the volume stored and distributed? What institution our organization supports or hosts the academic institution journal or the series? Who are the members of the journal's editorial board? This is a good question to ask because sometimes many open access journals are new. And by taking a look at who's at the editorial board or the advisory board of the journal, you get a sense of how much trust you could place in the journal and who is endorsing or vouching the journal as well. Another question you have to ask yourself is, what is your institution's relationship to open access scholarship? Does open access scholarship support your institutional expectations and personal goals, right? And the reason I say this, and I'm fortunate not to be part of an institution that does this, but there are many institutions that expect assistant professors who are on the tenure track to publish in established top tier journals, right? And that's why it's particularly important to take a look at who's part of the board, because you could have evidence to show that, yes, this journal is part of an ongoing sort of movement within the field, and many of these people are part of it. And then the last two things I want to bring up here, are you designing research that addresses a specific audience or issue? Or does your research have ideas, approaches, or data that might be of interest to communities and audiences outside of the scope of traditional academic outreach? And I think this is particularly important, again, for those of us who work with notions of power, control, identity, being, and so on. And then last but not least, make sure to read the small print whenever you're signing a contract or whenever you're publishing an open access text, right? There are still levels of rights that you can be giving with an open access license, and different license give you different responsibilities and privileges. Note that in the presentation, I've linked sort of the different types of Creative Commons licenses that exist so that you could check them out and develop a sense of what they're doing, what limitations they have, and what freedoms do you have to circulate and republish the content. When you are exploring funding options for open access publishing, one resource that I definitely recommend is the OA Books Toolkit, which I also linked on this presentation. And it offers a series of guidance on how to get institutional, external, and crowdsourced forms of funding for publishing your document open access. Another thing that I want to highlight very quickly is that there are some book publishers that will offset the cost of publishing an open access book or an open access chapter. And these waivers are mostly targeted to scholars in underrepresented fields or who come from underrepresented nations within a respected field. So keep in mind that like publishers such as Sage and Routledge do offer discounts and waivers for scholars from underrepresented countries. And that's something that you definitely want to keep in mind if you're having difficulties publishing your research. Another thing that you could do, of course, is to identify open access journals in your field. Within my field, we have emerging and they're becoming well-established journals focused on different aspects of children's and young adult culture, such as Research on Diversity and Youth Literature, International Journal of Young Adult Literature, and the Anuario de Investigación en Literatura Infantil y Juvenil. The important thing about these journals is that they don't charge authors for submission or publication, right? These are 3 journals that I have, for instance, that will accept articles and they publish them for free. And they're not predatory in that they don't charge any fees for you submitting an article to them in the first place. Note that all of these journals do have advisory and editorial boards that do comprise of well-known authors and researchers in the field. So I really want to push you to go out there and see what journals are out there that cater to open access publishing and that really take advantage of the benefits of doing so. There are still things that you could do to retain control over your work when open access isn't a possibility. So I want to bring your attention really quickly to the Spark Addendum. The Spark Addendum is a form created by the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, in which you have a form or an addendum that you attach to a traditional book contract. And what this addendum does is that it ensures that you as the author can freely share, distribute, and retain all of the rights to your work, even when it is published through a traditional press. I found out about this last year, and I have already tried it out, and yes, there are some publishers that are really receptive to it. I do have a book chapter coming out next year, for instance, that I added a Spark addendum to, and even though that chapter will be published in the book, I'm free to do whatever I want with that essay. I could publish it in my archives, I could publish it in my class depository, I could republish it if I want to in a completely different text. So again, I have the addendum linked here, but I do advise you to check it out, and even more so, just don't attach the Spark addendum and just send it to the publisher. Talk with them first and make sure they are aware what the Spark addendum is and that they are okay with you including it in any traditional academic contract. Last but not least, one of the best things that you could actually do is support and cite open access work. Doing so not only starts to create more clout for these journals, but it also shows that scholars are deeply reading and thinking about the issues that the journal raises. And I have here two directories that I always go to access open access work: the Directory of Open Access Journals and the Directory of Open Access Books. And once again, both of the links are included on this slide so that you could access these texts at any given point, and so that you could see what journal articles and books are out there. So I have talked a lot, but thank you so much for hearing about open access publishing and about my book. You could scan this QR code in the presentation to access a PDF or EPUB copy of my book. And I also have my contact information here just in case anybody wants to reach out. But thank you so much, and I'd be glad to answer any questions or concerns that people would like to raise. Y estoy más que feliz para contestar preguntas en español también.
So thank you so very much, Angel, for that beautiful, amazing presentation on your book and on scholarly publishing and open access. I did add a few of those links that you mentioned in the chat. Folks that would like to ask any questions can do so. You can open up your mics if you want, and just go ahead and we can start the Q&A session now. You can add them to the chat, whatever anyone feels is more comfortable. So we'll just open up the floor now for any Q&As. And thank you again, Angel.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and Mary sent a comment/reflection on the question. Angel, we have taught English 3202 for some time now with a queer literature focus, and we use Luis Negron's The Garden, which addresses both HIV and the creation of non-biological family. It's intriguing how the story helps students to understand the complex history of HIV, contextualizing it in a 1980s setting in metropolitan PR, and that students ultimately value that it does not have a happy ending due to the death of the main character by AIDS, but also enables them to imagine a healthy gay relationship, including sexual relationship, despite a diagnosis of HIV positivity, as well as the possibility of creating non-biological family relationships. I believe it enables them to engage with a queer text that addresses pain and loss, but does not leave them without hope in a dark space. I would like to have them consider your chapter on AIDS in relation to the Garden next semester to contemplate the power of LGBTQI texts without happy endings. Oh no, Mary, I think a lot of the notions that you put up are true. Not to mention as well that as educators of queer texts, we sometimes have a responsibility to show that HIV and AIDS are ongoing and enduring issues, that they are not something that has simply disappeared with the advent of retroviral medications and PrEP, for instance. There's another thing that I also want to mention too, and I discussed this in the book actually, but when I taught Two Boys Kissing, which is the central text that I include in my HIV and AIDS chapter for the first time, I was floored when my students were really open about the fact that they thought that AIDS was a historical issue, and I quote, that happens in countries such as Africa. And I remember that when my students said that, and when I asked my students, are any of you aware of the queer history of HIV and AIDS within our context? And not one student raised their hand. it's not only been normalized, but it's been forgotten, right? And I think that that's why it's especially important to have this focus on pain sometimes, right? Because there are times where we don't feel at one with the world that we live in. There are times when we're being told over and over again, it's getting better, it's getting better. But at times our bodies and thoughts and actions feel, I don't know, oppositional to this, right? And I connect this to how we're all haunted. We're all haunted by this cultural and historical hurt. Even students who aren't overtly aware of the ramifications of HIV and AIDS, that still like exists in the air. It exists around us. It informs how we live and breathe and even how we read. And I think that that's where these books do a lot of work in terms of contextualizing this history, but also showing that, like, yes, even today's youth, queer and trans youth, are connected to this history, regardless if we try to sever it or regardless of whether we try to cast this history as a relic of the past that has no bearing on the present. Thank you for that comment, Mary. I appreciate it. Any other questions?
Angel, I had a question regarding the funding process.
Yes.
I don't know if you could go into a little more detail regarding it. And I was very surprised at the cost of these chapters and books and how helpful, funding for open access scholarship is. So if you could just, go into a little more detail with that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The first thing that I think I recommend everyone do is to get a sense of whether your institution does offer any financial support, either in the form of fellowships or scholarships that are meant to assist with that. My institution, for instance, has a program called the Faculty Development Committee, which will assign funds based on proposals that they receive. So, for instance, I had to develop a proposal where I talked about my work to people outside of my field. I had to highlight sort of the importance of the volume and why publishing it as open access was important in terms of outreach or in terms of the scholarship that I ultimately want to generate. I did have to have some plan Bs and Cs in place just in case that didn't go through. And so some of the options that I were exploring, again, are a little unwieldy, but are very much possible. I was encouraged, for instance, to apply for a grant for the National Endowment for the Humanities as one of the options, and I could provide links to that fellowship out there. Yes, it's a difficult fellowship to obtain, but it is entirely possible. And again, it depends a lot on how you frame the research in a proposal. And then once again, I just want to emphasize the fact that, like, research various publishers of open access books and determine whether the publishers themselves have any programming in place to assist you with the financial costs of publishing this volume. Then last but not least, one more thing that I would deeply advise, get a sense of what the publisher's policies regarding open access publishing ultimately are. Like, again, I gave you this like ballpark number of costs that I've seen for open access chapters and volumes, but there are some out there that are much more cost effective, that won't charge nearly as much money for them. Thank you so much for that. Kevin, I see you have your hand.
Thank you. I think Kevin has his hand up.
Yeah. Great presentation, Angel. It's great to see you. My questions are more around like predatory journals and publishers, right? Because they were kind of the first to start promoting, right, open access publishing and things like that. And so obviously the royalties and the upfront fees that people pay are considerably cheaper than like what Routledge would charge, or really reputable publishing houses. And so I'm curious, like how we and I'm in a full agreement, right? We need open access, but I'm just wondering like how we like the market has like taken control of this, right? Like and so now they're like undercutting reputable publishers, or you could self-publish, right, for a fraction of the cost. And so I'm wondering if you could just speak to those three options, right? You have self-publication. You can literally do it essentially for free on Amazon, right? You've got predatory journals, which, to the untrained eye, are peer reviewed. They look legitimate. And then you also have more reputable, seasoned publishing houses and journals that do kind of abide by the traditional peer-reviewed processes and stuff like that. So if you could speak to those three differences.
Oh, absolutely. So, of course, self-publishing, I'm going to start with that one. It's definitely the easiest. It's definitely the most accessible, right? There are issues that come with it, especially when it comes to academic knowledge, because anybody could self-publish a book. And not only that, but you don't necessarily have the layers of peer review and of editing that are kind of crucial for this type of book. I will be upfront about something. The feedback that I got from the 4 anonymous reviewers in this book completely transformed the structure and content of the book. And if I would have self-published the book in its original format, I really think that would have been lost, one. And number two, you kind of are not part of a conversation as much, right? Because you're sort of entirely responsible for curating this knowledge, and there's really no one around you to contest you or push you on some of your ideas, right? Now, I know that like open access publishing, especially with book publishers, can be very unwieldy and very expensive. But I think that what we can do as an alternative is to really stick with open access journals, which typically aren't predatory and that cater to specific fields. And this is something else that I want to mention. Some of the best journals in my field that I'm seeing recently were formed through sort of grassroots movements. They were literally sort of a bunch of scholars within the field. For instance, Research on Diversity in Youth Literature was founded precisely because many journals were just not publishing research that focused on race, queerness, gender, and sexuality within youth literature and culture. And so you literally had like major voices within the field gathering together, forming an editorial and advisory board, and starting to change the culture of our own discipline. And I think that that's what I really want to sort of encourage, especially those who are tenured and who have a little bit more clout. You can start networking and creating sort of these grassroots journals to sort of change the nature of academic scholarship, to make sure that we as the scholars do have a lot more control, and that they don't have to be, that our content doesn't have to be filtered through a publisher's perspective of what sells or doesn't sell, or even more so, what ideas are and are not appropriate. I always think, for instance, about like how decades ago, many publishers wouldn't even touch scholarship with queer content that focused on youth culture, right? And think about how that was serving as sort of a barrier to the discipline in a way. And so that's what I would do. I would definitely steer clear away from any journal that charges you any amount of money to submit anything whatsoever. And I would definitely look for open access journals that were formed by people in your field through grassroots movement, or perhaps be compelled to start a open access journal on your own to contest this in a way. I hope that helped, Kevin.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I think this is part of the conversation that we have to be having, right? Like in how we're going to promote open access. And yeah, I agree. Steering clear of predatory journals and things like that. But that takes a considerable amount of education on the behalf of people teaching in graduate programs. And then for junior faculty to resist the multiple emails that one gets on a, it seems like on almost a daily basis. I'm getting an email saying, oh, I would love to see this. I'd love to see this article that you presented at X conference, right? And you think it's going to be published and it's going to be easy and you need it for tenure and promotion. And so, like that. Yeah, that's all. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Angel or Angel. And we'll see soon, hopefully.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Angel. We are coming up to the end of the hour, and I believe Edsel has one question. We could take that one if you can in the chat, and then I'll add a few links for the folks that are still with us. And I think with that, we would probably end it. Is it okay if I put in the chat your email in case anyone
absolutely.
has other questions for the? Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Edson, thank you so much for that question, and I'm gonna take it piece by piece just to because this is actually something that I wish I thought about, especially as I was developing the dissertation, and even more so as I was turning the dissertation into a book. When I look at my dissertation, I think sometimes what becomes really obvious to me is that I had too many ideas. I would take a look at each chapter, and yes, they were compelling, but they were really sort of disconnected to each other because I was trying to do too much, right? I guess what I would always recommend is the following. You have all of these ideas, but when you take all of these ideas into consideration, what is the story that you want to tell? And who do you see yourself speaking to? Where do you perceive that there needs to be a change, or that you perceive that people need to pay more attention to X and Y? And then hone in on that thing and make sure that that is the consistent story that you are telling across your project. It's very, like, I say this as someone who gets really sort of compelled with sort of like the new idea or the new text, and I keep on sort of adding more and more that I want to do. But I find that sort of cutting down and developing sort of a core sense of the story that you want to tell is incredibly helpful. Another thing that I will add to this too, and I know that this might seem counterintuitive to some people, but it's incredibly important, especially when you're working on such a large scale project, to take breaks from it, right? To understand that it's not something that you can be working with on every day, not only because of the labor demands, but sometimes because of the emotional demands that come with this. So like, for instance, I was very open with many people that while I was writing the chapter on HIV and AIDS, it was incredibly sad to write that chapter, and I was feeling down frequently because of everything that I had to read and everything that I had to process. But it was so useful to sort of take a break away from that and then sort of return with a fresh perspective, and it allows you to sort of like temper your emotions a little bit so that you have a clearer sense of what you're ultimately saying. Another thing that I want to like emphasize is just like, don't afraid to get personal when you need to, right? And even more so, know which rules can be broken as you are creating your work, right? There's only so much that can be done if you're always following all of the rules, if you're always applying these frameworks in neat and clean ways. Allow yourself to sort of delve into the messiness a little bit to see to what extent you can think outside the box or generate ideas that people haven't really thought of before. So I hope that that helps. And of course, I'd be more than happy to like talk with you more about dissertating because that did take over a significant portion of my life back in the day. And I still have a lot of feelings about it.
Thank you so much, Angel. I did put up a few links. I have the presentation link, so everyone has access to that. Thank you, Angel, for that. And we also have through our library databases, the Taylor and Francis Open Access eBooks, you have a link directly to Angel's book and also his contact. So you can also ask any questions to him directly there. Again, I would like to thank everyone for coming, for celebrating with us at the beginning of this Open Access Week 2024. We do have another activity coming up this week on Thursday, so I invite everyone to also participate. Thank you so very much, Angel, for accepting the invitation. As we mentioned, the stars aligned and your Open Access ebook arrived just in time for us to celebrate Open Access Week. So I'm very grateful for that. And thank you all that are here and online for joining us. And again, thanks a lot, and continue to celebrate open access. And I really hope everyone enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for getting here so early. Take care, everyone, and please email me if you have any questions. I'd be more than happy to further the conversation.
So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Angel.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.